slavery and mass incarceration with the belief that slavery didn't end in 1865, it just evolved. And the second was the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, or the Lynching Memorial. When you enter the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, you're met with these 6-foot-high pillars that have the name of the state, the name of the county, and then the names of everyone who was lynched in that county. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented nearly 6,500 lynchings of African Americans between the years of 1865 to 1950, and those are only the tip of the iceberg. What really personalized this history for me was seeing names with the last name Stewart on the pillars, realizing that it was simply just time and place that separated me from this era of domestic terrorism. As you continue through the museum, the pillars are originally perpendicular to the floor, but as you make your way through the museum, they begin to come off the ground until finally they're hanging above you, causing you to visualize the way many of the victims of lynching died. When you stand in the center of the museum and look around you, you're surrounded by the 800 pillars symbolizing the crowd that was so frequently present at these events. And this was all such a profound encounter with history for me to learn about something that no one had ever told me before. I left feeling aghast that no one had ever told me about the extent of lynching in America before, and I couldn't believe that I had to go all the way to Montgomery, Alabama, just to learn that there had been at least one widely documented lynching of an African American here in Oregon. And so that's how I learned the name Alonzo Tucker. In conjunction with the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, the Equal Justice Initiative also started the Community Remembrance Project, which aims to work in the communities where the lynchings of African Americans took place to find healing and reconciliation through a sober reflection on history. And there is an interest forum online about getting involved in the Community Remembrance Project, and I would love to say that when I first saw that, I was immediately like, sign me up, how can I help? But in reality, I was a recent college grad with no relevant experience, and I ultimately figured to myself, who am I to really think that I could be of any help? So I decided that I wasn't going to fill out the interest form. But thankfully, over the course of the rest of my trip, I was inspired to change my mind by two things. The first from a quote from John Lewis, longtime civil rights icon and congressman from Georgia, who asked, "If not us, then who? If not now, then when?" And this really inspired me with the fierce urgency of now. The second was the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, where they just focused on Mississippi history. So there was no Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, individuals who we kind of deify and are hard to relate to. Instead, the museum told the story of everyday Mississippians who did their part to pave the way for justice. And so there at the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is where I learned that you don't have to be an extraordinary person to do extraordinary things. And so that gave me the courage to reach out to the Equal Justice Initiative, and man, I keep getting older, and now it's nearly 4 years later. And so I'm super excited to be here with you all to share a little bit more about what happened in between that filling out that interest form and the historical marker that you see outside today. To share with you sort of what we're doing beyond this, how to continue this truth and reconciliation work in other spaces in Oregon, and what we can sort of do with these stories of injustice, and how we can add new chapters to history.
Great. So one of the things we'll be doing, of course, like the next trip, right, is to go over to these places that I was able to go there. We were almost there at the same time, right? So that's how we sort of our paths crossed. But when we get there and have that experience of not only the memorial and museum that's there, then we'll of course touring around Georgia and Alabama and some of these sites. I think you should saw as well. Okay, so you come back from that trip, Mississippi and Alabama, and you've got this sort of mission now that you want to accomplish. You have, if I understand, no connection to Coos Bay at all, but you reach out to them and sort of begin this conversation. So if you could share with us a little bit, like what was that initial contact like, and how was the response from the people of Coos Bay and sort of leaders of Coos Bay?
So I got back from my trip full of youthful inspiration. And I remember, so I filled out the interest form, and eventually the Equal Justice Initiative provided me with 3 emails of other people who had filled out the same interest form for Oregon. And it took all, so there's a quote from Cory Booker that I really love, of "Don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing. And I was like, I don't know how to do this project, but what I can do is I can send out the first email. And so I worked up the courage. I was like, I can send this first email. And then, surprise, everyone was from Portland. And I was like, that's not helpful. But nonetheless, we were able to, I was like, okay, well, we're all in Portland. Let's get together in person. And so we went to McMinimum's downtown near Portland State. And I'll never forget driving there thinking to myself, man, I can't wait to meet who's gonna lead this. And then I remember driving home, and I was like, oh no. Oh no. And honestly, I can't fully remember what some of my strategy was at the very start of this. I just know it's going around telling people I was gonna put a historical marker about lynching in Coos Bay, Oregon. Most people thought I was crazy. But eventually I was able to connect with someone who worked at OHSU doing rural health. And they're like, you should get in touch with the History Museum there. And so that's how I first got in touch with the Coos History Museum. And this was the fall of 2018. And so I reached out to them, and I had done a lot of thinking of, all right, how do you propose to a community to make a public display about such a difficult part of community history? And so some of my original sort of proposal was through this idea that, you know, we can't change the past, but we can always change our relationship to the past. And that through these acts of remembrance, we can add new chapters to history, so that Alonzo Tucker's story doesn't have to end in 1902. And so, you know, originally, the initial reaction was not, yes, kid from Portland, we would love to put a historical marker about the worst thing that ever happened here. But, you know, this was also 2018, 2019, when we hadn't had a national racial reckoning. This sort of talking about racial injustice was still semi-taboo in the year 2019. And so, you know, in my sort of young, naive self, I was like, I'm not gonna do the soil collection, I'm gonna do the historical marker. I was wrong. We needed the soil collection as the sort of first introductory for the community of, this is to be able to do the soil collection. You're like, oh, you know, I was originally feeling hesitant or reluctant, or what is this action gonna do to our community reputation? That was a big one of, we don't wanna be known as the community where a lynching occurred. But what we're able to do is now if you Google Coos Bay lynching, you get all the stories about the different reconciliation works that happened. And so instead of being the community where lynching occurred, it can be the community where lynching reconciliation happened. And so we did the soil collection February 29th, 2020. It was one of the, yes?
What's the soil collection?
In the museum, you'll see a jar of soil that says Alonzo Tucker, Coos Bay, 1902, where we collected soil from 3 different parts of the landscape of Coos Bay, where each bit of soil sort of part of Alonzo Tucker's story. Where the first bit was gathered from the mud flats underneath the local docks, where Alonzo Tucker spent the night hiding from a mob that had formed to lynch him after he had been accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. The second bit was gathered from out here near Front Street, where Alonzo Tucker was repeatedly shot and left incapacitated before a noose was placed around his neck, and he was thrown in the back of a cart with the intention of lynching him from the spot of the alleged assault. And the third bit of soil was gathered from where the old Marshfield Bridge used to be, which is where the mob strung up Alonzo Tucker's dead body from a light pole in front of a crowd of 300. And so we gathered not very far from here down Front Street as sort of the first ever sort of public remembrance. We had sort of a large tub of soil, and community members were able to sort of physically put their hands into the story and transfer the soil into 2 jars. One that is in the museum just over here, and then the other that was sent back to the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. And so when you go back to Montgomery, you'll be able to see the secondary jar of soil. And so there were, you know, I was a little bit nervous. I was like, I don't know how many people are going to show up to this. It's kind of cold February, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe like 20, 25 people. but instead we're able to have sort of 200 people come out, and it was sort of and so we had the mayor, the city council people who were able to see this idea that they had originally been semi-hesitant to want to participate in, was actually able to be healing. That there was sort of something positive that could come from this sort of historical reflection. And then eventually, so, as we all know, March 2020, the world shut down. And the original plan was to create a small plaque that would be placed on Front Street. But sort of due to the murder of George Floyd, there emerged a new, larger group of folks in the community that wanted to, so I always wanted a historical marker. I settled for the small plaque. But a new group of folks emerged in the community who wanted to, once again, do something more meaningful than the small plaque. And so from that, the city was able to see that, oh, there are more people in our community that care about this than maybe we had originally thought. And so eventually they sort of formed a new task force with the city, the History Museum, myself, and some other members from the community. And from that, we were able to come up with the historical marker that you'll see outside. And we did the unveiling ceremony last Juneteenth as part of Coos Bay's first ever celebration of Juneteenth. And this year, their Juneteenth celebration has grown into a full 3-day event. And so this small coastal community here in Southern Oregon has been able to grow this cultural holiday because of the foundation of last year's celebration. And what was numerically significant is we had 300 people in person and then another 300 people watching online. And so we had double the number of people who were actually at the 1902 lynching. And what I tell people is that the historical marker is not just a retelling of history, it was also the making of history. As there are now 2 dates of significance on the historical marker: 1902 when the lynching occurred, and 2021 when the historical marker was unveiled. We now can't fully understand Alonzo Tucker's story, only focusing on the 1902 date, as his story now continues on into 2020 and 2021, when the same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And so I didn't tell anyone I was going to do this at the historical marker. I could do very much on the down low. But within this idea of reconciliation, I like to say that there are 3 R words: remembrance, repair, and redemption. And in order to get to that last R word of redemption, we need to have the courage to undertake the first 2. And so the soil collection in the historical marker is the remembrance part of reconciliation, but remembrance alone doesn't get us to redemption. We need repair. In this case, we must repair the fundamental question of who our society believes deserves death, because the answer continues to be disproportionately African American. And so my speech at the historical marker unveil was all about how we need to end the death penalty in Oregon. Because at the same time lynchings in the United States started to go down, state-sanctioned executions started to go up. During the 1930s, 2/3 of all executions in the United States were of African Americans. Between 1910 to 1950, despite making up only 22% of the South's population, African Americans accounted for 75% of all of those who were executed in this region. And this disproportionality continues to today, where African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 41% of those who are on death row. And when we consider the fact that of that 41%, nearly all are African American males, yet African American males only make up 6.5% of our population, we have to ask ourselves, how do we get from 6.5 to 41%? The color of your skin still plays a crucial role in whether our society believes you deserve death or not. And so I was nervous how this proposal to end the death penalty in Oregon would be received here in Coos Bay. And I didn't tell anyone I was going to do it because I was like, this is already polarizing enough. And then to my resounding surprise, it was met with great enthusiasm. And the folks, everyone who was gathered here in person were like, yeah, let's end the death penalty in Oregon. And so it was a great learning experience for me to be able to see that, once people do this remembrance part, they are then ready to move. They're more likely to be ready to move towards this repair. And I believe that there is a transformation that happens in between repair and redemption. And I see that transformation in the way that Coos Bay has grown their Juneteenth celebration. Last October, the Coos History Museum held a workshop for other museums on diversity programming. And that's a sentence that wouldn't have existed 4 years ago. But because of this work and their willingness to sort of move continually down this process of reconciliation, there was a transformation that was able to happen. And so I'm super grateful to be back here and be able to see the sort of how this work has set a foundation for the way the community can continue to grow towards these aspirations.